Hello everybody. Welcome to Cerberus at the Improv. My name is Andrew Meloche. I'm replacing our colleague Payman Askari, who is, I think, in Alberta in a conference. Most probably he will watch us and comment through the entire show. I'm accompanied with my colleague, Mr. Timothy Knight, the King of BC, until he will be King of Canada. So, how are you today, Tim?
I'm I'm concerned that you use the phrase commenting from payment with the real term would be heckling.
Well, I I'm the boss today, so I can
Okay.
display or not his comment. So I
Then
think we
then
will be
we
able
we
to
have been
manage.
saved from the IRGC today.
And I think we will have a very good show today. We have a very special guest, Mr. Charles Ficner from the Our Principal website. Charles, how are you today?
I'm very fine, thank you, and very happy to be here with the two of you.
We are very pleased to welcome you. We prepared the show with payment. We talked a lot about what we will discuss about today. We will talk about the founding principle from the Treaty of Paris, the BNA Act, the British North American Act. We will also talk about production and consumption and maybe what would be the future of representation. But first, Charles, could you describe a little bit your path and maybe what is this website ourprinciple.ca for our
Um,
audience?
uh, my academic background is as training as an architect. I, having graduated in architecture, decided that I would like to work in policy and government. Worked in environment and then energy for quite a number of years, and rose to executive level in government, and am as responsible as anyone for some government programs that cost taxpayers up to $2 billion. Um, I I would say that if I had to do it over again, um, even the programs that I consider big successes, I would not do again, because I think they lead to a kind of attitude and approach in government that either the programs fail completely or people begin to mimic successful programs um, with ones that don't have the background or substance. So, so my last job was as director of strategic planning for National Research Council, strategic studies actually, and so really looking at where Canada's R&D activities take place and how they translate into economic and industrial development. And I left that job quite a long time ago, not long after we had prepared a draft strategic plan that was getting a reception that it was trying to be biased in a direction that was not sound in my view. And I remember saying to my boss at the time, Bill, I'm 42. I've got lots of years left to contribute. I've got no years left to waste. I've got to get out of here. And so at 43, I left the government, and since then have written, read a lot, read an immense amount, and become involved in trying to change government policies at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels, largely with very little success. And where you do succeed in gaining some change, positive change in one area, what you often find is having found that path to get change, government changes the rules, so the path is blocked and it can never be used again. So I wrote two books which I never tried to get published. One called Lost Principles of Our Civil Heritage, in which I look back through the history of the West to try to say what are the common principles that kept being articulated again and again and again in societies that led to our own societies where people we purport to have freedom and real and equal justice and everyone really matters. And the second book was called The End of the Age of Arrogance, which was looking at the loss of credibility of our government institutions among thinking people. And about 3 years ago, I should say that I've worked with some people who have been trying to get into the political system and bring about change. Usually very hard to do because the current way in which things are structured favors the existing parties, and they will control and overwhelm everything. But I did write with a number of very thoughtful individuals a document, a set of principles for a small political party in Ontario, the Trillium Party. And a few years ago, someone whom I met by chance, we got into a discussion, and he said, "Would you be willing to work on that again to elaborate on what those principles are that have this long history in the West?" And that led to some considerable frustration where people tried to use them in ways that I would never have supported them being used. And so a small group of us got together and prepared our website, ourprinciples.ca. And the purpose of that website is really to outline what are the principles, the common ground that has been shared in the West, and the perhaps the if you, I don't know if it's easy for you to flip to it, but if you could, in the website we have as well a document called Our Principles, the Rights of All Persons and the Duties of Government. The principles, and let's just, can you go? Not coming up easily there. Right there. Read Our Principles. Top left part of the page.
Yeah. Is that this one?
That's this one, yeah. And so what it lists is what we believe are these principles that have been articulated again and again over millennia in societies and in the heritage of the West, essentially saying that every person matters, every person has rights, and governments have duties, and that their primary duty is to uphold those rights. So governments are a service organization. It's the individuals who matter. And our conclusion has been that in order to get the change in our society, we have to have a further discussion of what are the things we agree upon, what are those principles, and if we understand them, then to begin to try to get our government institutions molded in a way that reflects those principles, rather than having continuing along the direction that it has been going for some decades, which is, instead of governments being there to serve and protect, they come there to command and demand, so that they become our boss rather than our servants. And we think we need a further and fuller discussion among citizens at a grassroots level, to just discuss what are the foundations that we really stand upon, and from that then begin to move into a discussion of government structure and government policy, instead of going along the direction that we primarily go now, which is to start discussing policy or programs. And if I make an observation back to my time in government, what you would find is that government actions were often driven by some whim. If we have this policy, if we have this program and we're giving money to people, we can win an election. And so the program is there, and you might say, well, under what policies does that fit within? And you might say, well, these are the policies that matter. And no one really asks, well, does that make sense from a principled level? Wow. Whereas in a government of principle, you would start the other way around. You would say, what are the principles? And deriving from those principles based on these issues we face, what are the policies we take consistent with the principles?
Yeah.
And then what are the programs that marry up?
We're talking about strategies and about grassroots movement, and I think Tim can elaborate on that toward his own experience with not only with the People's Party, but also as a business. He's a man of business. Maybe Tim, you react to what Charles is saying.
Your discussion where principles is the filter through which a policy must be sifted.
Yes,
that resonates with me in the perspective of grassroots management, administration. You refer to service, that the government is a service organization, right? So it's in the service of the people. I have this burgeoning view where I look at the energy and the lack of discipline and coordination that is provided by grassroots, because it is not coordinated. It is very energetic and quite undisciplined. And then you have to find a way to match that with a professional populism, where a populism is actually an organizational structure, a professional, finely tuned tool, like a business model or you weld the two together. And what ensures that the top does not oppress or manipulate the bottom, or that the bottom does not corrupt the effectiveness of the model, are these principles, right? So the principles refine the grassroots, and the principles prevent the populace, prevent the top from becoming totalitarian.
It's exactly right, and that's what I think we really need to get back to, and what we have done is effectively shuffle principles off to the side. The the we could talk about
Well,
political.
maybe shall we go to we say the core of this show? For example, you propose a series of document, the BNA Act and the Treaty of Paris. Maybe how we would present this to go back in Canadian history and explain how it happened, how we arrive and we have those principles that are corrupted. Where we will start?
Well, I think you mentioned the Treaty of Paris. I think, which followed the 7 Years' War between England and France, that the Treaty of Paris is a profoundly important document, not in itself, but in its consequence. We had this ongoing struggle between England and France, and the most Canadians will know Wolfe defeated Montcalm in 1759, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and that war finished in 1763 with France ceding all of its territories in the Americas to Britain. Now, France played a little bit of a game here because it owned quite a lot of North America, or controlled a lot of North America. And maybe you could pull up the map that actually shows the French territories.
Yes, yes,
The,
it is this one here.
yeah, exactly. So the sort of yellowish land is uh, it, Quebec is in here too, but the 13 colonies were very clearly the British territory, and they had some land in Nova Scotia. But France controlled all of the pink, and certainly the Quebec area and Gaspé. It also controlled the green, which is to the left, the west of the Mississippi. And in the course of that war, I guess France knew that it was going to end up ceding these territories. And so it played a bit of a game, and it basically said to Spain, look, we'll give you all of the part west of the Mississippi, Louisiana. And then it was left to give all of the pink to Britain. And the yellow in the north was Rupert's Land, Hudson's Bay Company land. So Britain acquired all of this. But to try it, if we leave that map up, it's maybe worth leaving it for a minute, because we're going to come back to that. But what happened was very interesting at the time. That Britain, because of the 7 Years' War, Britain's economy was in a shambles in 1763. It had a massive debt from the war debt, and it also had a huge production problem, industrial problem, economic problem, because all of the British industries that had been producing goods for the war, bullets, guns, uniforms, wool, blankets, etc., no longer had that British market. So Britain had to pay the debt. And so it found itself in a huge economic crisis. So what it said was, let's switch to the next map, which shows the way in which Britain managed the top of the pair of maps. this one, which is showing what Britain did with this territory. So what it did is it created in the spring of 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed. All of this land came to Britain, and Britain looked at it, and it found that people from the 13 colonies were moving west from the 13 colonies into the green and blue areas. And the king concluded very quickly, I don't have a government structure in place. So let me create a government structure to manage this. So in the fall of 1763, there was a document produced, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, in which the king said, let's leave the map just for a second. I am creating these territories. I've got a government of Nova Scotia, of East Florida, of West Florida. I've got a province of Quebec, which is the pink area you can see at the north and to south of the St. Lawrence. But then there was the blue and the green area to the west. And in those areas, the king said, I haven't yet got a government figured out there. So until the sovereign will be known, until I know what I want to do, but out of those, the governors of the existing colonies and the new ones I've created don't start giving land, and my citizens don't start going in there, because I don't know how I'm going to govern them as yet. So maybe we flip to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and we just scroll down through it a little bit to see how this was put in words.
If I may ask, maybe Tim, you want to react to this, because we think about Ireland, but we think also about what you mentioned, Charles. The British government was in economy. He had economic problem, so he had to outsource or to release some territory because he could not defend it. How do you perceive this, Tim? From let's say from an Irish perspective, because we talk about Irish and Scottish too, Scotland.
I don't really have an Irish perspective. What I'm interested in is why he had segregated the two blocks of land as they were, like, the pink and the green, thinking that, well, I've got this single large group, but the block of land, I'm going to break it into two, and I still don't know what I'm going to do with it. So was there an intention even back then to use two different waves to populate and govern those two sections of land? So how far back does the crown go with plans to create two separate colonization phases?
Flip back. Can you flip back, Andre, to the map we just had, if that's easy to do? The intent. The problem was, do I have a government structure, a provincial type government structure? And so he had acquired all this land, but he didn't have any government structure. So he said, I'm quickly creating governments in Quebec, in East and West Florida, and there are a few other areas as well. We can see that if we flip to the Royal Proclamation. But yeah, his intention was to deal with the green and the purple areas later. And that says, so don't go in there. And it specifically says in the Royal Proclamation, until it doesn't say royal will, but until the royal will be known, until I know what I want to do.
Yeah.
So if we look at, here we are. So if we so what he's dealing here in the green part, we have just acquired all this huge amount of land. So if you can scroll down, Andre. So what we are doing, and we have structured a number of governments. Here we are, under the names of Quebec, East Florida, West Florida, and Grenada, with limited boundaries. And these ones, I know how I'm going to govern. So I know Quebec, and I know East Florida, and scrolling down, Andre. Got West Florida, government Grenada, and then we're linking the islands of St. John and Cape Breton to Nova Scotia. So we've got that government. So we've got a number of governments already existing, and we're going to stick them together. And I know how I will govern these territories. So if we roll down, keep going till we get some other color part. Okay. So therefore, with the advice of our Privy Council, declare that it is our royal will and pleasure that no governor in any of the colonies of those new places will grant lands beyond the bounds that we have defined. So that's the purple and the green areas. We're not. I don't know what I'm doing that, and so for the present and until our further pleasure be known, don't do that. Hold off. So he's really saying, yes, I intend to do something here, but I don't know what it is yet. I need time. And part of the problem was that from the 13 colonies, people were immediately moving to the west and trying to claim ownership in lands in that territory. And so the king is essentially saying, hold off, don't do any messing around in that land. I'll establish governments when I'm ready to do it. But on the economic front, he did something else as well. And that is to deal with the economic problem. He said, and the British Parliament said, all of these territories will not manufacture anything. What you will do is you will be providers of raw resources that you will put on British ships owned by people who live in Britain and ship them to Britain. They will be manufactured in Britain and they will be shipped back as finished goods to you in the Americas. So this created a huge issue. And so the pressure began to build, particularly in the 13 colonies, to say, wait a minute, we're very sophisticated people. We have a manufacturing business. You're killing us here. And what that did is it started to create pressure for, in the Americas, the 13 colonies, particularly the English parts of North America, to say, wait a minute, you're harming our rights as Englishmen. You're taking this away from us. You're destroying our economy. And so the question was then, how would that evolve? So Tim, you asked the question of what happened about, was there a two-staged approach? Yes, there was. And the second stage approach was the Quebec Act, 1774. So if Andre, you could bring up the map of what he then did, and the map rather than the act itself. So what he then said was, I am now going to massively enlarge the province of Quebec. So if you look at the pink area, you can see the original province of Quebec, and then you can see that massive area to the west covering all of the Great Lakes.
Are you saying, Charles, that it was including all the Great Lakes?
All of the Great Lakes was Quebec.
Wow.
As
Quebec sovereigntists would be very happy today.
East Lake of the Mississippi.
Everything east of the Mississippi and north of the Ohio River. So well down into what is present day United States. So in the Quebec Act itself, so maybe we can flip to the act, because it's interesting here, the actual wording. So he says, so it starts off, whereas the Royal Proclamation said I had established these provisions and these constraints and these boundaries, I am now ready to move forward in defining a new system. So if you can scroll down.
Again, so by doing this, he establishes the right of precedent to move forward.
He's exactly showing, I am changing my government structure. And here, so if we stop here, this is actually a really profoundly important part of the Quebec Act, passed by the British Parliament in 1774 and effective in 1775. The former provisions made for the province of Quebec are null and void after May 1st, 1775. So if we move down to the green part, that said proclamation, so far as the same relates to the said province of Quebec, are hereby revoked, annulled, and made void from and after the date of May 1st, 1775. So the Royal Proclamation restricting use of occupancy of land was dramatically changed. So if we could flip back to the map we just had a minute ago, that begins to show some really interesting consequences. So this is now 1774, 1775. And the people from the 13 colonies on the eastern side of what is now the United States were still pressing to move west. You will notice there's still a chunk of Greenland that is on the west for which he has not yet defined a government structure. And so the occupants of the 13 colonies who wanted to move west are feeling really pressed. And they're feeling pressed as well by their inability to actually manufacture things, and that requirement that all of their goods be shipped as raw goods on British ships to Britain, manufactured and shipped back. Now, the 13 colonies in the United States were very advanced. They had among the most educated people in England. They had probably an equivalent number of newspapers to the whole of England, and they had a very highly educated population who had left England and to some extent Holland and France, seeking freedom. And so these were thoughtful people about what it takes to have a good society, and they were escaping religious persecution. So you had a very educated, informed population who now are being blocked from having any possibility of doing advanced manufacturing. And the
I
U.S.
would have I
Go
would have
ahead.
a question, Charles, about what you're mentioning. Tim mentioned two stage in immigration, if you can call this. Were they two classes of citizen? Because you talk about the people in the 13 colonies who were well educated, they had a lot of newspaper, they were organized politically, while maybe the North was less organized. Is it correct to think that you had two type of settlers, or
I think it is in the area of Quebec. The original intent of the Quebec government, and remember, in France at this time, we're dealing with the Ancien regime, and it's a very
yes?
repressive regime dominated by the church and by the king. And so their intention on the territories that they had controlled was largely to collect furs, etc. They were the traders rather than settlers. And as the
Okay,
13
yes, you're right.
colonies as the 13 colonies developed as a more advanced society, free people doing all sorts of things, the French king and Cardinal Richelieu under Louis XIII and so on.
Louis
Louis XIII.
Louis 15, yes.
Well, I'm going back to Louis XIII when Cardinal Richelieu was still there. So it
Yes.
had been there for a couple of kings before. They had decided that they were going to develop settlements, but it was a slower process than was happening naturally by those fleeing the repression in Europe that were going to the British colonies. Timothy?
So the HBC as a harvesting company,
Yes.
requiring only a certain degree of education for its employees and its distribution, are able to, as a knock-on effect, prevent more educated classes from gaining a foothold because they weren't required. So you have a workforce that has control of a large harvesting area. So this is the resource development that Europe wanted through British Columbia. And HBC maintains that because they also control the trade routes,
Well,
right? And
HBC.
so just to expand for a half a second, that means by pushing Canada down to the Ohio River, as far as, well, not Canada, but you know what I mean, as far
Yes.
as now declaring all of that pink land as resource development land, you effectively hem in, you create a wall along the Ohio to block westward advancement of the more educated mercantile manufacturing class found in the 13 colonies.
That's effectively correct. Now, there is that green strip, remember, and the green strip still, he hasn't got a government in 1774 because he
That's the
just,
Appalachians, isn't it?
it is that and west. So they were occupied by First Nations people, and the king still left that. I still have to figure out how I'm dealing with the First Nations and where I'm going. But any implication that the Royal Proclamation said was a treaty with First Nations is clearly thrown out for the Pink area, because the Royal Proclamation is revoked, annulled, and made void in 1774, and the government of Quebec, so much enlarged Quebec, can do whatever it wants. I would say that there was, and I don't know the sequence here, but the Hudson's Bay Company was a British company. You also had, coming out of Montreal, the Northwest Company, which was primarily a French company and controlled that area, and that eventually merged.
Yeah.
So, and of course, the Royal Proclamation and the Quebec Act did not go west of the Mississippi. That was still at this point Spanish land.
Right.
So what this did is it led to ultimately and very quickly to the American Revolution, because the 13 colonies quickly said, well, look, you're hemming us in, you're blocking us, you're making us hewers of wood and drawers of water, and we cannot develop. And we want the rights of Englishmen. You're denying us the rights of Englishmen, which is why we moved to the Americas. And so the Americans, pushing for their Declaration of Independence, 1776, they wrote a long list of grievances. You're putting your soldiers in our houses. You're preventing us from doing this. You're blocking this. These are the rights of Englishmen, and you're denying them. But let's look at what was happening in the Pink areas in Quebec, largely French territory, and initially trading, but then gradually becoming settlement. And we're in the Ancien Regime. So this is this top-down, autocratic, no concept of freedom society that existed in France at the time. And what did they have? They had the seigneurs with the seigneuries, and you had the church.
Yes.
And so the Americans said, well, they should want the rights of Englishmen too. But they were a different culture. They had come from a different background. And so Britain went to those who were in Quebec at the time, the church and the seigneurs, and said, if you stay on our side, we will give you the privileges. You can retain the privileges you've had, the domination of your people. And they went along with this. And so the American Civil War, the American War of Independence takes place, and those who were the governors of the 13 colonies were largely driven out. They moved to Canada, and we in school are taught to praise these people as the United Empire Loyalists. What were they? They were the autocrats. They were the ones imposing this top-down control.
You're mentioning something important, and I think we had this discussion. The differences between privileges. You say French or the settlers were having privileges compared to British citizens who had rights. So can you explain this difference between what would be a privilege and what would be a right, especially in this type of conflict, like Tim mentioned. People are well educated, they have a well developed economy, and compared to the autocratic Ancien Regime France was trying to impose a top-down structure.
And which existed in 1763 when Britain took over those French territories.
Yes.
So effectively, you had an autocratic king and peasants with an intervening structure, and that intervening structure was the church, and it was the lords who ran the area. Whereas those who had left Britain and France and Holland and gone to the 13 colonies had come to seek the freedom, the rights of Englishmen that had prevailed for an incredibly long time. So those who were driven out in the American Revolution then moved into Canada and established again this autocratic top-down governor control system that had been put in place following the end of the 7 Years' War, Nova Scotia and Quebec.
Can we say that they were opportunists? They were taking advantage of an old regime to impose something?
I think inevitably and absolutely that's what was happening. So the rather interestingly, if we move just a few years forward, so this is now 1776. The
Yeah,
Americans break
exactly.
free, and and and
And let's not forget the 12 to 13 years before the French Revolution. So
and
it was
that's
there. Okay.
precisely the point. So that what happened then in the is you move to 1789, the French Revolution comes. We've got Louis XV, we've got Marie Antoinette. People are starving. The elite are doing incredibly well. People are repressed in France, and people are hungry. And Marie Antoinette says, "Let them eat cake." And whether that actually happened or not, we don't precisely know. But the
But the
impression
metaphor is there,
the
yes.
metaphor is there. And so you had the French Revolution, and the revolutionaries, those who led that, were absolutely extreme, the ones who took over the government. And they were so opposed to the aristocracy and the church, which had been dominated. The government system had been dominated by cardinals.
Yeah. Well, Robespierre is basically an avatar of everything that went wrong with the revolution.
You're exactly right. So what happened here was that in France they were so angry with the church that not only the guillotine came in, and all of the lords they could catch they were executed, and the clergy was displaced, and they were so angry with the church that they wanted not even to have a reference to Christ in the year 1789. So they changed the year to the year one. So 1789 became year one. So that control of the church and of the aristocracy disappeared entirely in France in 1789.
But
Karl
what
You can
you're
Marx
argue,
would
saying,
be proud.
it disappeared in France, but it was still here in Canada.
Yeah.
and that is precisely what the British took advantage of in going to the French colonies in Canada and saying, "Stay on our side, and we will keep you, the
So,
aristocrats and the clergy,
so
in charge."
it's
Tim,
I see now my ear is burning up with the word Laurentian.
okay, let's open the rabbit hole. Go ahead, Tim.
So and I'm not as familiar as I ought to be, but when you're moving into that period where Britain is looking at aristocratic French influence in, Upper Canada, so to speak, and interested in maintaining that as the right hand of the crown in Upper Canada, because if the like you said, the difference we will continue to give the elite, right, those who were loyal, we will a privilege in Upper Canada to manage and to maintain and to keep their wealth and their influence and their generational holdings, as long as they continue to do the will of the crown.
It's effectively right, and when that large Quebec, of course, some of that disappeared, became part of the United States as of 1776. But what was left was eventually split into Upper Canada and Lower Canada, and what it was run by governors, and Nova Scotia was the same.
Yeah.
And so these were the still top-down
Yeah.
controlling systems that were put in place, and eventually there was a legislative assembly created. But the whole thing was run in Upper Canada by the family compact, a bunch of elite families that dominated, and in Quebec by the Chateau clique. And so we had again a very top-down system of government, which was very consistent with that remnant of ancient France, with the
Right.
top-down control, and it still was based on the notion that we will be hewers of wood and drawers of water, not free people doing the manufacturing, which was increasingly happening in the
Yeah.
United States, in the independent United States. So our heritage has always been one of extraction of resources, um, uh, uh, top-down control, rather than United States, which was struggling to have freedom and to reassert the rights of Englishmen. And
If I
maybe here, Andre, if I could have you bring in the piece from the Magna Carta. Is there any chance? Well, it's probably readable by most people. Um, the Magna Carta was it came about in 1215. Britain had a very long heritage, demanding that, talking about the rights of persons. King Alfred the Great in the 800s had the first written set of British laws. It started with the Ten Commandments. It didn't start with governments controlling or dominating us. And increasingly, kings, particularly after the Norman conquest, tried to become autocrats and dictators. And King John eventually was brought to bear on this, with a revolt, where he was called to Runnymede and forced to sign the Magna Carta. Now, one of the things, and the reason I've chosen these two articles from it, is they really say, let these customs and liberties be observed similarly in all of our kingdom. So the king is saying, I agree. I'm going to allow these customs and liberties, these traditional customs and liberties, which were of freedom and rights of persons under God, and that governments had a duty to uphold them. But 61 is really interesting, and this is a compressed version of it. It's a fairly long text, but it says, if I or any of my officials should violate against any man against these principles, then the barons and the community of the whole shall then distrain and distress us in every way possible, by seizing our castles, our lands, and our possessions, and in any other way they can, until redress has been regained. So here we have a system in Britain that is totally contrary to the idea of the imperial king who can make laws and commands. We have a system where they are, the duty of the king is to protect the rights of citizens.
So, if I may say, you have checks and balance, you have duties, and you have the creation of a structure that will be that will oppose the authority of the king if the king abuse of it.
And the systems are put in place precisely to do that. And Britain does not have a written constitution. I mean, it does now, but
That's very important.
It never had it. What it had is a whole series of documents that together establish these principles of rights and freedoms. And I chose from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, who's viewed as a big defender of the king by many people, a statement about the role of Parliament. And he's saying, if the assembly voted to violate these rights, that's a crime. And any member who didn't register his dissent on any statute is responsible for the crimes committed by other men. So what you're seeing is a clear recognition of there's something higher that controls and dictates what is allowed to be done. And this is completely opposed to the concept of royal sovereignty, where the king is a sovereign in terms of being commander. The king is a person who must uphold, his duty is to protect the rights of citizens.
That's in theory. Go ahead, Tim.
Note about Article 61 is that's reflected in the American Constitution. The people have a responsibility to resist a totalitarian government. So that's reflected there. And the Thomas Hobbes refers to a willful dissenter, for example, in today, person who an MP who abstains from a vote. This is precedent that says you are responsible for the effect of your abstainment.
Both you who actually vote for the bad measure and you who refuse to oppose it vehemently are guilty of the offense. Yeah. And in British law, there used to be a concept of in effect two tiers of law, of punishment. Their capital crimes were crimes where you abused your position to deny rights. So not only have you denied rights, you've abused the powers of a public office. And so these capital offenses against the Constitution were far greater than a mere crime. because it's the abuse of power of public office. And that was in many ways the evolving concept in Britain. And I chose the Magna Carta in part to say this is not new. This goes back, and in fact it goes back long before that.
Yeah.
Of this higher sense, which was completely overwhelmed in France in at the time of the Ancien Regime, where the king was.
Sorry, Charles. We can maybe refer to what's on your website with the code of Hammurabi, the king of Babylon. When I found that very interesting, because those rules of check and balance or duty for a king or somebody who's ruling over people, they're very old. They're not something that is new in I would say, the second millennium. It's something that is quite old. And Tim always mentioned Babylon in a way that we have precedent in history that show that we can have a system that works well. If we consider where we are now, what would be your comparison between the old, I would say, the history, and where we are now, or what we would call maybe modern era after the Second World War, 1945 until today? Maybe Tim, you can maybe describe our actual reality.
What I'm finding more interesting here is we're actually revealing that the concept of noblesse oblige was taken very, very seriously by the upper class and sovereigns further and further and further back. So
Yes.
that, as you say, they did not see themselves as gods with which to do as they will among men, but they saw themselves as a protector, right? So rather than Zeus, they saw themselves more as Thor or Hercules, right? And it's interesting when you mention these articles and these small sections that identify, if we go against the will of the people, it is the people's obligation to call us to task. And that does not exist today because our modern governments hide behind corporate entities that cannot be taken to task. So they have given themselves leeway to abuse a sacred role, which is to protect and or administer the people. You mentioned the difference of identifying what a capital crime is. What came to my mind immediately was capital crime that is responded to with a death sentence. But it's not. I'm wrong. But this is a public perception. So over time, the public has been given language and concepts and ideas about, let's go back as far as the Middle Ages, because that's as far as we need to go back, where there was a high degree of feudal responsibility and feudal autonomy, and a more right hand, left hand operation between the people and their lords and their kings than there is today. If we've had conversations saying, once upon a time, if you were in the feudal era and the landlord said, I need you to come and wage war with me next spring, and you're like, I'm not coming to wage war with you because who's going to feed the people? We have to, and the Lord was not able to simply say, you come with me and that's or die. They were not able to do that because the relationship was much tighter, much more responsibility. To whereas now they have separated themselves with the authority of, what have we done with government? Somebody said we've hired out to those who will do violence on our behalf. And so that's government. And having hired them to do governments on our behalf, they now use that against us as well.
It's in a general sense, I would agree with you. What I would say is, in the particular, what you find is that lords of manors abuse their serfs as well, and so you had this constant struggle between these rights and every person being equal under God, and you find this in Aristotle, you find it in Plato, you find it in Cicero, that that there's a difference between law and legislation. Law comes from above, and governments are constrained by law, and governments are allowed to pass legislation. But what you find is in the administration of justice, those who are in those positions of power often sought to abuse the power for their own ends.
Yeah.
But at least the principles were there. That
Yeah.
that and so you see these constant struggles, and you see it in. I mean, I'm sounding very positive, I think, towards England, but we had some really abusive kings. It wasn't just King John who was abusive. It was followed by many abusive kings: Henry VIII, Henry VII, and then the
Charles.
Stuarts. And so eventually King Charles was beheaded, and they re-articulated how the structure should go, consistent with those old ideas and principles.
Mhm.
Now you caused me to digress a bit. There's another book that I kind of like to
If we
refer
didn't
to.
cause you to digress, then I have failed.
Well, one of there's another book here, Law and Revolution, Harold Berman, written in the 1970s, a Harvard prof. And what he does is he looks at the British system of law, and he goes back to Saxon times, and then he looks at how justice was applied. And what this is maybe an unfair characterization of his book, but what he does is he effectively says you create these institutions to uphold justice, these principles of fundamental justice, and then the people running them begin to take them over and use them for their own ends.
Yeah.
And it's the same with governments. And so what he does in that book is to trace the way in which different systems of justice came into being as the old ones became corrupted, and some of them coexisted, and people would choose the one that would likely provide more justice, and so the other one would fade away. And although he doesn't put years to it, what you can say is the time period during which the time over which it takes for a system to become corrupted and controlled, running for those running it rather than for the purpose it was created, might be 100 or 150 years before you need radical revision and or correction.
This
Now
is
it makes me
interesting
think
what
of
you're
unions
mentioning.
in North America.
Say
Well,
that again.
one thing that is important, you're mentioning the corruption. Tim is always mentioning that all those institutions or those law or those concepts are good because they have been tested. But Tim always say it's those people who will benefit from those systems and they will start to decay or be. How do you prevent that in a society? Tim,
Well,
maybe.
what they did, and what Berman points out in the legal system, is the system's naturally evolved. You get pushback in the British Parliament. You had
It's alive. It's organic.
yeah, you have a revolution. The king is pushed aside. You get a temporary parliament with the king displaced. Then you get Cromwell taking over, and then Cromwell is kicked out, and eventually King Charles, his head is taken off,
Is
and
beheaded.
James and James II flees to France, and then they establish a control system, and they passed what was called the Act of Parliamentary Supremacy. But it actually wasn't actually saying that Parliament is supreme. What the Act of Parliamentary Supremacy said is, look, King, you can't pass laws. And we have those come from above, and we, the Parliament, protect people. So we are supreme over you in preventing you from violating laws, and Parliament then gets constrained. But if I do my invented, it's because Berman doesn't put it quite this way. 100, 150 years is the maximum you can have a system before it needs radical fixing. And our system of law and government is a lot older than that. And so what's happened is the institutional protections against revision have been lost. So it's not that our structures are conceptually wrong. It's that those running them have undermined them and taken them off the track for which they were created, to uphold those rights and to hold government to account.
If I take
And
an example, for example, we think about the Baron de Montesquieu and the separation of law in one of his essay. is showing that it is important to separate those power, to have accountability. But up to a certain point, if you dilute the power, you don't have any authority, whatever it is, moral authority. I think Tim is always mentioning this, that the system in itself, because they were tested, those concepts, they were very good, but
The British
we
system is
we arrive at the end of an era now.
the British system is actually really an interesting system, and Hayek actually describes it as the highest development of these systems to protect freedom. So let me describe in theory our system. We have an unwritten British Constitution. Can you bring up the piece from the BNA Act, Andre?
Yeah, wait a sec. Royal Proclamation.
No, the one that talks about the Constitution Act.
This one here.
Yeah, that's 1867. You see this in the preamble. It says that these provinces have expressed a desire to unite with a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. So what is the Constitution? That's that unwritten Constitution.
Well, that's funny because it's similar to a constitution in Great Britain, and they don't have any.
But they do have a constitution, except it's not written. And they have all of these documents: the Bill of Right, the Proclamation of Right, the Magna Carta, and there's this long history and tradition of law which includes that separation of powers and control, and the separation distinction between law and legislation. So what they're saying is it's not a written constitution, and it certainly had no written constitution in 1867. So it's talking about we are adopting those principles which put individuals first. So that really it's incredibly significant, and so every individual matters. They're free to do whatever they want as long as they don't cause harm to someone else. Government's job is to protect rights. But let's flip to 1982. So we patriated our constitution, and we ended up writing a constitution. So let's look at what happened as an example in section 15 of the 1982 Constitution, part of the Charter.
Wait a second. Where is it? First
It's
part.
interesting that they use the word principle to that of the United Kingdom.
It does not say words. It says similar in principle. So the attempt and the understanding at that time was still we had that ancient rights of persons and duties of government.
Yeah.
But
in Christian theology, that's the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law.
Exactly. Or the difference between, as Rome made out, the natural law and civil law. So you're really saying that the natural, or Plato and Aristotle do this too, that law exists and governments are bound by law, and the law derived from the rights of persons and everyone matters. So, but what happens here is quite interesting. Section 15 is the equality rights, and in the British concept, everyone is equal. And yes, it's not always practiced that way, and it wasn't always practiced that way, and you had this abuse of power. But what you find is that 15.1 says every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and benefit of the law without discrimination. Let's leave the rest out. It's a subordinate clause. I don't think anyone could quarrel with that. Entirely consistent with that concepts going back to Hammurabi.
Exactly.
So then let's look at 15.2. Subsection 1 does not preclude any law, program, or activity that has its object the ameliorations of conditions of disadvantaged individuals or groups, including by race, religion, etc., ethnic origin. So what that's saying is we don't have equal laws at all. That if you can show that or claim to be disadvantaged as an individual or a group, the government can actually pass laws, and we've lost the distinction now between law and legislation. They're stuck together, and the only law is the law written by Parliament.
Yes.
And if I can make a comment here, a digression, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations in 1948, in Article 8, says that effectively, I mean, this is not a direct quote, but it's the sense. Every person has the right to have by a judgment by a competent tribunal determining whether, in order to protect the rights granted to them by Constitution and by law. So rights no longer belong to you. Rights come from government. And so if governments write the Constitution and write the law, they can determine what rights you have, and they can take them away by
They
changing
can take
the
them
law.
away.
So this whole ancient concept of individuals having rights has been undermined in 1948 in the UN
1948.
and Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And here we
Yeah.
have a clear statement in 15.2. Governments can pass different laws for different people depending on whether they deem them to be disadvantaged.
Well,
So
that's interesting because it refers to minority and people who are either segregated, and they can after that apply. Tim, you wanted to react to maybe
We had mentioned this in an earlier conversation. What I see in section 2 is the birth of intersectionalism, right? Where you can drill down and drill down and drill down and separate and separate and separate and identify and identify and identify. And that could change with this season. Okay, all of a sudden now everybody's wearing white after Labor Day, right? So you can modify 2 as you see fit, and one is moot.
So 2, what 2 does is it effectively creates a race to the bottom in claiming disadvantage. So what happened in 1982? This was in part a reaction to the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, where finally Quebecers started to say, "Wait a minute, this domination by the clergy and elite should not be there. We should all be equal citizens."
they started to react to the autocratic that was still in place since, like you mentioned, after 1776. Yes.
It's exactly right. So it's finally there's the pushback, the Canadian Revolution that is the American Revolution for the demanding of rights comes starting in this time. So what then happened is this race to the bottom is created by clauses like 15.2, which begin to replace the unwritten constitution, the unwritten principles, with a written constitution that gives the government the right to create special rights and privileges for whomever they deem to warrant them.
Now I understand something. We were preparing the show, and you were referring to Napoleon and the civil code of Napoleon that was that influenced the civil code in Quebec. Now I understand that the common law is something that is not written. It doesn't mean that you will interpret it, but it is natural. It is something that rational people will be bound to, compared to a civil code who will be, like you mentioned, granted by an authority. Now I understand the difference. For me it was a clue. What is the real definition of common law? Because
common law is in effect that what comes from right. I'm using Cicero's words. He uses in one document 3 terms: God's law, natural law,
exactly,
right reason. It comes from the people. It's an understanding.
Exactly. But that's what for me that was a clue, because I could not understand the concept. I was telling myself, okay, the common law, it is a law, because it's not written, it is between people who are rational. But now I understand it's related to rationality, to natural law, compared to the law of the government, which was still in place in Quebec.
Yeah, in Britain, that concept, you're looking at the courts, the job of the courts with the separation of power was, and remember, I had said that King Alfred's law started with the 10 Commandments. So this is God's law. That's the way it was viewed in those times. You could see natural law or other words, but in it, the question in the courts there's a term we still use in courts called discovery. And in discovery today, it's you go to a court and you have to, the different parties come together prior to going to the court itself, and you get all the documents out, so everything is put forward. But the job of the courts conceptually under common law was to discover, if we go into a fight and I am in a disagreement with you and I say I stand on this view because of this principle, and you say no, I stand on this principle, and I'm trying to argue them back to common law, to natural law, to God's law, the job of the court is to discover what God would do. How would he resolve that apparent conflict between these principles? So that concept of discovery was dealing with this higher authority, this natural law. What is this natural set of principles that apply, that dictate what is right? Not what does some legislation do? And you mentioned, and I think it is worth noting that when we brought our charter, created our Constitution in 1982, there was a lot of talk about Canadian law being a merger of common law and the Napoleonic Code. Now, so 1763 was the date at which France ceded all of that territory to Britain. 1763. Napoleon is born in 1769. And so that's still the time of the Ancien Regime. So it's hard to see in 1763 how we could have adopted a Napoleonic Code when Napoleon wasn't yet born.
Wasn't born. But you when you mentioned that, I was appealed, and I went to try to find some documents, and I found they were referring to the Code of Paris. It was not the Code of Napoleon, and Napoleon, when he wrote his civil code, he was influenced by the Code of Paris in 1763. That's why a lot of people, they think that it's influenced by the Napoleon civil code. But you're right, it is not. But me, I have a question, and maybe Tim, you can react toward when you're saying that the Declaration of Human Rights was written in 1948. That would undermine the law of God. Can we see the disappearance of great mythological discourse like the law of God? We don't see it anymore. Secular state and the rise of what we call a secular state, without separating the church from the government. Did it arrive in 1948 with this declaration?
I think it arrived right around the time Nietzsche was making his seminal works, right? When he realized that our attachment to the age of reason either created an amalgam of law and legislation, right? That which is natural and immutable, unchangeable, versus legislation, which can be modified by culture and or need, which is made by man. So Nietzsche comes in and says, do you see what you have done? And the outcome of this, right? The outcome of such a thing moving forward is going to be governments, agents, and agencies who behave as if they are God or gods.
As if they are God.
As if they are gods or gods. Because, like you say, this amalgamation or this merging of law and legislation, where law was a behavior of God, right, or the effect of God, and then the legislation, which are laws made by man. This is reflected in Christian theology, particularly the Old Testament, where they refer to the written Torah and the oral Torah, right, where the written Torah is considered that which is divine, and the oral Torah also divine, but not written, and largely tradition and cultural application. So whereas in the clergy in those respects have the opportunity to maintain that separation, or to blend the two and to take control unto themselves. So what I see is we have governments today, when they say we have passed law, most of them don't understand what they're saying, but based on this progression of legislation and policy over time, this is indeed what they've done. They have not killed God per se, They have transcended to become God.
Well, there's one thing you mentioned about the Torah, or the written law and the unwritten law. The unwritten law, you can interpret it between two rational person, two rational people, two rational men. They will debate, and they will arrive at an agreement. If it is written, you are bound with this. You cannot get out of it. Maybe the concept, like Charles, you mentioned, the concept of common law that is not written. The real difference between, I think you made a very good observation, the difference between a law and a legislation. We don't understand this today. I did not.
No,
It- it-
I mean, there would be a vagueness because we've talked about natural law or natural philosophy, right? So we understand that certain things in the universe just are. Right. They are features of the universe, behaviors of the universe, right? So you drop an object, it will meet with the earth. This is a fact, right? So so we have ancient rulers, kings, chieftains, etc., right, who understood I am only in this position because I intelligently use the natural laws to move into this position, right? The Petersonian discussion about moving up the pyramids of cultural structure. The quote unquote good ones, once at the pinnacle of that cultural structure, understand I am only here by grace, right? So to speak, right? Right?
Yes.
Right, where grace is, I've used the laws, the natural laws, to my benefit, and now I am leader of this tribe. So you move into more civilized eras, right, Hammurabi, etc., where they realize by codifying these things we restrain ourselves, and thereby so too the people among each other, right? That's we do that, what you noted was it, I can't remember the name of the section now, where they said if our government goes astray, it is the people's obligation to correct us,
To correct us.
right?
Exactly.
And right,
Exactly.
so and that's very, very old, because while we look back at very, very old histories, like, well, so and such, conquered these kings, and these kings and became, the king of all kings, etc. And then, but what we're actually watching is as they moved in and took another land, largely they left the people as they were. Largely left the people as they were. Alexander would be kind of an example of that, right? So he would conquer a land. He was after the kings, right? He takes the titles and basically leaves the people as they are. Whereas we move into that's what do you call it? Postmodern or modern democracy, where they have intentionally amalgamated, merged natural law and man's law, and given unto themselves authority over life and death and the comfort or discomfort of their fellows. So then the
it
question
certainly,
moving forward is how do we remedy that?
without looking at remedy, I want to reinforce the point that in ancient Rome, well, I go back to actually ancient Athens, where they chose their citizens by lot, and so they were in the assembly. I'm not sure the proper pronunciation, but it was their legislature. But what was interesting is if the legislature if someone introduced legislation that challenged the law, they could be beheaded. So there was that massive distinction made. And in Rome, you had ancient Rome. Well, you had a distinction between what was called use, and leges. So the leges are legislation. Jus is justice, and so leges could never trump justice. So the concept was clearly well and deeply entrenched, and
There was
certainly not
there was sorry, go ahead.
in Britain. If you go to the time of the American Revolution, the text, the principal legal text was Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. And in Blackstone's commentaries, this distinction, this difference between justice and legislation, or law and legislation, was still completely understood. But by the end of the 19th century, you get Dicey writing about law, And Dicey has merged law and legislation into one, and it all comes from the legislature. So and to pick up on Tim's point about Nietzsche is this is a very simplistic way to view Nietzsche, and maybe it's not actually correct, but Nietzsche effectively said, look, you think we're running on a society that's based on God's law and fundamental justice and real and equal justice? Get real. God is dead. There are men and supermen. And the supermen will take over and run and command and abuse and exploit mere
Well,
men.
in a way, in a
That's
way,
how our society runs.
in a way, he was saying exactly what you're mentioning decades before, that there's a danger to merge the law and the legislation, because you will be bound by man and not by something that would be rational. Uh, there's something that we talk about how we interpret law and legislation. John Adams, who was I think one of the founding father of the American Constitution, uh, was describing how they wrote the Constitution in the United States. And I will quote him. It's not correct, but he was saying we have to make sure that when we will write the Constitution, we will not undermine the power of the future generation and desacralize the memory of the older generation, saying that the Constitution has to be able to sustain time. And I think it is referring to what you're mentioning, Charles. The law of God, they have to be there all the time, even if we have legislation. And maybe they have the American Constitution, we don't. What we do have now, it is a document where I think Tim mentioned, merging the law and the legislation. How will we get out of this? I think about, you mentioned it earlier, the second topic, from production to consumption. We are Canada, we are a country of natural resources, but we do not develop our manufacturing sector, because we are still in this system of extracting and exporting. How we will get through a society that will have a good, strong manufacturing industry? We had some in Alberta, but oil and gas, you extract oil and gas, but do we transform it?
No.
How can we achieve maybe what the United States did in the 20th century? Maybe Tim, how do we get out of this?
King Charles came by a couple of months ago and gave us what for? Did he or did he not make proclamation sitting in that chair?
And can
He
you remind us of
absolutely
that
did.
project?
And we've talked about this. Charles came to his dominion and sat in that chair and made proclamation. And in that proclamation, he said, you are a nation of resources and you will produce your resources. He
That's it.
reminded us once again of our role as citizens under the crown, be the crown in all of its nefarious definitions that we've been using, and reminded Canada once again, you are a nation of foresters and furriers and farmers, and you will give your wealth to the crown.
To
We've
the
been
crown.
reminded of that again, right? So everything that Charles has mentioned today regarding the degradation of the founding principles over time still exists today. And we actually had our own monarch come here 2 months ago and tell us so.
What does that mean? Go ahead,
the,
Charles.
the extraction process, the extraction concept is deeply built into Canada back to that 1763 and
Right.
the British rules that you will actually pull out the raw resources. And so what was Canada? We came here and they took the cod, we then took the furs, we then took the trees, we then took the minerals. We're taking the oil, we ship the oil to America where it's refined, and then they sell it for a much higher price.
Yeah.
This this concept of just operating at the very base level is deeply built into our structure, but
Yeah.
it's an extraction process. And so let me actually speak specifically to another example of this. We're now talking about the Ring of Fire in Ontario, which has billions of dollars worth of minerals and of extreme value. And some of them not available. Well, they're available from China, and that supply source could be limited and cut off. But what's interesting, and most people don't know this, is that mining companies in Ontario, which is the world's leading mining jurisdiction, 15-year-old data, but 80% of the world's mining capital in the world comes through the Toronto Stock Exchange.
That's
So people
crazy.
can't come here to register.
Yeah.
But why do they do it? Well, they don't come here because they're going to pay high taxes. They're going to be environmentally conscious. They're going to pay a lot of resource. The Ontario legislation allows mining companies to go onto public land. This is old, so it's slightly different now because you can do it by computer. But a prospector could go with a $25 prospector license and stake a claim on public land. And if minerals are found there, they can eventually develop, and they can even get public resources to help them do it. And the royalties they pay on metallic minerals is zero. There's not a
Zero,
single
exactly.
not a single cent of royalties are charged. And in Ontario, when I was looking at this in some detail, it was about 2% of GDP, 2% of employment. It's not massive. But what's happening on Bay Street is really interesting, because we begin to export our policies of saying don't charge royalties. And we get that through the companies that register here, and it's applied in Colombia, it's applied in Bolivia, it's applied in Chile, in the Congo. So we attempt to get those countries to adopt our policies, so there are no royalties. And there's a tax charged, a very low tax, on profits, because there are all kinds of deductions you can have. Capital cost write-off on mines in Ontario is 200%. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, you buy a truck and for $100,000, $1 million, and in the first year you write off $2 million on your income because of the 200% capital cost allowance deduction. And we're being asked, in the case of the developments that are proposed in Northern Ontario, to pay billions of dollars for roads and railroads to get the minerals out. So here is something that will be gone once it's gone. It belongs to the people, and the province is basically saying mining companies come in and take it out, and we will pay to help you get it out, and we won't charge you any royalties on the minerals.
And
Go ahead,
Carney
Tim.
has been saying that Canada will meet its 5% obligation to NATO using our minerals.
So and maybe that's true. Maybe you can count it in a different way. But the way we have done things, and Carney basically saying, our debt is not really our debt. Our debt is investment and debt. So I'm going to not count that part. I'm only going to count this. So our debt's going down when the expenditures are going up. So creative accounting can do a lot of things. But I use this simply to say we're still on that approach of hewers of wood and drawers of water, and we're not looking at the further processing. And part of the reason for mentioning the TSX and the large number of companies is to say that we are taking money by extracting money from those who are taking minerals from the Congo and Colombia, etc. So we've just found a more sophisticated way of still gathering things without being productive. And if we're to get out of this mess we're in, I think we have to start being a productive country, shifting back, as you, Andre, were suggesting, and Tim, to some of the concepts that were undermined in 1763. And that French, the 7 Years' War between France and England is a profound change in direction from the British tradition to what we have. And the Americans
to the original, would say the original British politics or concept. Today we're in 2025. We are still, mining companies. They have a very bad reputation everywhere on the planet because what you're just explaining, we are exporting our legislation toward royalties. I think Barrick Gold and some companies who are exploring in many countries now, they are targeted. We have a bad reputation financially. You mentioned the TMX, but it's how do we get out of this? Because the policy of Mark Carney, like Tim said, it will it will not change the core definition of what we're doing. We are extracting our natural resources and we're not developing any. The 21st century, we just have to look at China. We look like third world country here compared to China. And it's not about coal or gas, it's about how they develop their industry. And I'm not saying China is perfect, but you can compare the cities in Canada with Shanghai or Beijing, and you go there and you're like shocked. It is not, you cannot compare what is happening there. How do we get out of this with the actual system and our actual politician?
To defend our system, people elect in our constitution representatives to the parliament. The job of parliament is to keep the government under control. Unfortunately, parliament and government have been stuck together increasingly, just as parliament and the selection of the courts and so the legislative and the executive and the judicial have now been merged.
Yes.
So that Montesquieu distinction between those three separate parts of government has largely been lost. But the concept is there. Our constitution has no role for political parties, none. So we are supposed to have our representatives holding the government to account. People have talked a lot about changing the voting system, and they want to have a proportional representation. But the proportion isn't by people; it's by parties. And what has happened is the parliament is now controlled by parties, not by representatives of the people. So if we could, in fact, restore the intent of our system, we would have a government. And so let me hypothesize a way to do this. So Ontario had a vote on a proportional representation system where everyone would have two votes. You'd vote for the party and you'd vote for a candidate. And so let me change that a little. So in Parliament, let's say you are not allowed to have political parties at all. You are choosing your representative to sit in the body that keeps the government under control. Your separate vote would be to vote for the government, where political parties could exist. So you have a competition among political parties running on a platform to say, this is what we will do in the executive. We're taking on the executive part of government. So we would elect the executive so that the executive is there to run a set of policies and programs. But in order to do it, they have to go to Parliament, and they have to get the statutes, and they have to get the money. And so then they go with
sound republic.
Well, let me say it's actually. I'm going to say no, and you'll see why in a minute. Because so what they do is they then go to the Parliament and they say, give me the legislation and give me the money. And Parliament says, well, we don't like the way you're doing it, so you can't do it that way. Yeah, that's the policies you ran on, but you're actually violating these fundamentals. So find a different way to achieve your policies that we can give you the money and the legislation.
That could be achieved if we activated the Senate to do such a thing.
So you're right. House of sober second thought. So let's get the Senate out of control of the political parties. We've now got Parliament out of the control of the House of Commons. Let's get the Senate out of control of the political parties. So there's a second thought. Then what has to happen? It has to go to the Governor General. And if you look at the oath of the King after the Glorious Revolution in Britain, and when King Charles was voted in, what does he say? He's given a gauntlet. I take these gauntlets in order to protect people. Take the sword in order to do this, to look after the poor, to prevent exploitation and abuse. There are so many garments that he has given, the orb and the scepter and then the crown, each with words that describe this other level of protection. So we should have a government putting forward policies. we should have a parliament saying, no, you can't do that because it violates fundamental rights. We're not going to give you the statutes, the legislation, or the money. We're going to have a governor general, Senate that says, no, still there are problems here. We want another level of thought on this. This is the noblesse oblige trait remnant in the Senate. And then it goes to the governor general who looks at it again. And we still then have a separate body, the courts, at which this can be challenged. So if we went back to the institutions if we had turned the institutions we currently have back to their intended role when they were created, we actually have so many levels of protection of those fundamental rights.
Okay, Charles, it's interesting. We have level. Now we have a situation, and we want to merge, or we want to evolve to another situation, which would be the system that you're describing. Do we have any strategies to do this, and how we can do it with the actual political class? Is it possible to find people? Maybe Tim, you can answer first, because you always refer to the grassroots movement that comes from the people. What would be the strategy to merge from A to B?
I'm keen to summarize what Charles just said and check against his intent. First level is House of Commons acting in a nonpartisan manner to develop legislation. So the second level is Senate acting as it's intended, this House of sober second thought, right? Probably keen on financial management tools. Then the Governor General actually paying attention to noblesse oblige and the ancient oath, and the courts themselves behaving as a initial check against legislation, because as we mentioned earlier, law or the legislation must serve justice.
Well, one thing you mentioned, Tim, Payment is thinking about us, and Charles mentioned it, the discovery, the justice system, the judge, they have to discover what would God do. Go on.
And then as Charles noted, we have a government that basically picks the judges, and they brag about it. They brag about in 2023, the then Justice Minister bragged that he personally put 700 judges in Canadian courts in 1 year. Right. So you're right. So losing our executive body, our legislative body, and our justice body into one organization, which is effectively managed ad hoc by the Prime Minister. And it has been that way for at least the last 10 years. And probably if you look back at Harper in his last 4 years, you would see similar behavior at times. Right? Because he too prorogued. Right? He too played those games.
There's no government system that evolved from the British system, including the United States, for all of its flaws, that concentrates as much power in the hands of the Prime Minister as Canada.
Exactly.
And that is not new. That you can argue
it is George W. Bush that told Jean Chrétien many years ago. He said that I really envy you, and Chrétien said, why? He said, because you have more power than me, and I'm the president of the United States. What you're mentioning is it's not new, but
it goes right back to the United Empire Loyalists coming in, establishing the system after 1763.
That's what you were referring to,
and that whole top-down control, which undermines the rights of individuals, and the agreement that was effectively struck with the nobility and the clergy in Quebec, which spread and continued through the system.
But you gentlemen, you're avoiding my question. We go from a system that is corrupt, does not work, the structure is good, the concepts are good. How do we merge toward another system? Is it through a revolution? Is it through a political revolution? How do we change this?
I'm reminded of what Charles said at the top of the show, and that is, any system exists for about 150 years before it requires radical readjustment.
Are we there?
Well, how old is Canada?
It has, but it goes back before 1867.
Yes.
So where it has to come from is from an awakening of people. And if you look at the American Revolution, it's interesting because we mentioned the American Constitution. I don't know if we mentioned the Declaration of Independence, but there's a massive difference between the two documents.
Hmm.
The Declaration of Independence is a list of grievances. What it says is, we are really angry at Britain and its king because they've done this, which violates this British right. They've done that. And it's a constant list of grievances. These are the things that are wrong, that are undermining our rights as the rights of Englishmen. The Constitution itself has no rights discussed in it at all, because all of the founders of the United States had read Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England, and they knew that the laws were natural laws. They knew that they were the common law, and that's what they accepted. So the Jefferson himself massively argued against any Bill of Rights, because he said the minute we put words into our Constitution, the courts will fuss over the meaning of the words. So rather than going back to discover what the principle is, we would actually debate at a very technical level and lose the concept. And he
Yes.
won.
Yes.
Eventually,
Well, look
eventually
at section 2. Right?
of our
Now we're into
Constitution.
jots and tittles, right? So
Yeah.
so what's gender? What's sex? What's this? What's that? And so we've fallen into the weeds on that
We've
ourselves.
gotten right down into the weeds. Now, eventually Jefferson lost because he introduced the Bill of Rights, which is, the First Amendment, Second and Third Amendments. But those were amendments. Those were not the Constitution.
They
as
were not a
originally written.
constitution. Yes.
So the other thing that's a bit of an interesting background on this, in this very secular time in which we live, is that Jefferson then became ambassador to France. France was still ticked off at Britain. They'd lost the 7 Years' War. They had helped America during the United States, the 13 colonies during the Revolution. But Jefferson becomes the ambassador to France. And he's the ambassador to France in 1789, when the French Revolution occurs. So then you get, what do? We're turfing the church. We're turfing God. We're getting rid of all of this. So you can't call on God's law anymore. So you need to have some written document that reflects what that is. So Jefferson was the primary author of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. So there you have the precursor.
He went against
his own ideas, but because the concept of God and God's law, which was inherent in the British system that they were defending by calling on Blackstone's commentaries, couldn't any longer be used in the new French government that executed the king.
We could have an entire episode on the French Revolution and who were the instigator. Gentlemen, we've passed the 1 hour and 39 minutes already. Maybe we can jump to some question from the audience, and we have our co-host or host Payment, who's asking a question for Charles. Did people stray from their faith, or did the Catholic Church push them?
And this question was asked back when we were at 1763 discussion.
Yes.
So
how would you answer that?
French Canadians.
Are you gonna answer?
Asking you.
It's a question for you, Charles.
About the
were they pushed?
Were they the abuses of the Catholic Church on the early peoples in that time?
Well, certainly it's hard to know at the time of the French Revolution who really decided the church should be gone. Was it the French people, or was it the leaders of the revolution? We don't really know. But what we do know is that there was a lot of resentment against the cardinals who had been working with French kings, who were creating a system that made the king all powerful, and that in
Cardinal de Richelieu, like you mentioned earlier.
exactly, and there were two others who followed him into Louis XIV and Louis XV. And were there abuses in the church? Of course, there were abuses in the church, and the British, in Europe, through the Middle Ages, kings could not become a king without the approval of the Pope. And part of the conditions that the Pope often said was, "Well, give me 40% of your land." So you had all these monasteries holding huge territories, and some of the monasteries were, the monks ran them basically as their own fiefdoms, and exploited and abused all of the people, and there are probably a lot of illegitimate children born of monks, the serfs looked after by monks. So was there an abuse of power?
Lots of Spain has that story too.
It's through all of Europe. So
It's
it,
interesting because there's another comment about Middle Age. You're referring to the Middle Age. Oliver Haythorne wrote, "Power was actually more decentralized in the Middle Age than many assume. The top-down centralization came later. The Americans revolted because they wanted to reestablish the older paradigm, which would be what, the natural law."
I don't know what the person raising the question is really thinking, but I could agree with that wording. I might question what was decentralized in the Middle Ages. There was decentralization, of course, but some things were very centralized and controlled in Europe by the Church, the Catholic Church. So depending on the state you're in, if you looked at Germany was a very decentralized state. And some states were far more centralized, and the control was very centralized. And in England, in that period following the Norman conquest, you had baronial courts, so the barons had a lot of power. So there was decentralization, and Henry II tried to centralize it. So, but there were top-down controls, and there was decentralized authority as well. And there was the concept of noblesse oblige, which basically said if you were richer and you had better education, you had obligations towards those who were less well off. So there was a mixture of exploitation and degrees of decentralization and centralization, which varied.
Yes, and there's another comment from Wolf, who is a regular viewer. He said, "The spirit of the law, not the letter of the law." What you were mentioning earlier, Tim, I think. There's another thing about
As opposed to like the intent, as opposed to the
yes,
directive, right?
exactly,
And so
exactly,
we're speaking as comparing principles versus policy, right? So that even in Western theology, the spirit of the law is where mercy is found, right? The letter of the law is where justice is executed. So we need to find that balance, and Western culture has absolutely lost that balance.
exactly. There's another. Go ahead, Charles. Sorry.
No, that's fine. You go ahead.
Oh, that is because there's another question. We were talking about the actual politicians and how we merge from, or how we evolve from situation A to situation B. Laurie F says, "So what's the remedy of purging the parasitical class?"
Well, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and talking with people, and I've tried to change a number of policies and at federally, provincially, municipally, and you find you almost always fail. And if you do succeed, I think I mentioned this before, the path that you used will be blocked by legislation or some other process. I think what the way forward has to come from people. And I think maybe now that we're in a time of radical shift of affordability of housing, of food, of evident unfairness in the use of government policies, partly under Section 15 too, treating people differently by race, religion, or whatever it may be. That and the inability, particularly of the young, to find jobs and to see the future ahead, and maybe people of my age to see a very troubled future for our grandchildren whom we care. Maybe there now is the opportunity to have that discussion. What do we really stand for? What is the common ground on which we stand? And I don't think if we focus it on policies, we're going to divide, because people have different views on what policy should be taken with respect to public schools or how school funding should work or what should be taught in schools. We're going to debate this, and we're not going to agree. Particularly thoughtful people are going to have different perspectives that require a lot of discussion and debate. I think we have to focus on the principles. Let's find the common ground of principles, and that's what we tried to put together in the ourprinciples.ca website, is to say, is this the base? This seems to have persisted since the time of Hammurabi. Different words, of course. We've just chosen words to put them forward. But if we could unite on those things, then we might have a basis around which to say, I will elect someone who will stand for these principles. And in Nova Scotia, for example, they've been trying to have a group of independents run for election, and the processes have been set up to block them from even having running. But they're in a court. They're in a court hearing now, which suggests they may have the right. And what these candidates were doing, loosely affiliated into this independence movement, is they were saying, this is my contract. This is what I will do. And if I do not live up to this contract, here is how you can get rid of me. That I'm not here even necessarily for the term. So if we can look at the frustrations and find a way to get representatives who will actually not play games and not refuse to answer questions in question period and abuse power and avoid presenting budgets, if that frustration can be reflected in steps forward where ordinary people have a say, where there's more discussion of what our common ground is, and then see how do we get to put representatives who will uphold those principles.
Do you think, I'm not a fan of direct democracy, but do you think that the independent phenomena that's rising is a reflection of the desire for something more direct?
It might be, but I'm not a fan of direct democracy either, because I think if you were to have, for example, a vote, should we take the wealth of the 10% of the richest people and distribute it equally among all the rest? You could imagine a majority would very likely choose, yes, of course. Those in the 90% would be glad to take the money from the rich.
And that's the Achilles heel of democracy. If the majority are lunatic, you're in trouble.
So what you need to do is to go back to the principles. And so in the British system, there's the constitutional democracy, right? Constitutional monarchy. And what's the Constitution? It's that vague, unwritten, let's discover what it is, set of principles, the natural law, the natural rights of persons, what reasonable persons would do in a fair society, and respecting the value and the worth and the rights of every person, so that we can do whatever we want to do as long as we don't cause harm to the rights of others. That's not easy to translate into specifics. It requires a lot of thought. But if at least we can get that fundamental there, it has to. I think it has to come from the people.
It is interesting, and if I have to just remember one word, it's the word discovery. When you were mentioning how judges have to discover what God would do in this situation, and I think we lack maturity to be able to discuss without emotion and to be able to disagree on many topics. But like you're mentioning, we are not in a mature society in Canada. A lot of people act emotionally because they are involved either in a minority, they want to keep their privileges or their, I don't see any way that we can get out of this in a short term. It will take maybe a generation, which would be 20 years, or unless we have a very hard political conflict. We had a show a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the political crisis, constitutional crisis. You know what is happening in Alberta now, and I think many Albertans now will be deceived because the actual political leader are not trying to free Alberta from the Canadian Federation. I don't say they should get out of Canada, but it seems to me that they're playing a game with the federal, and I don't understand. I don't know how we can get out of it if we can.
The
Andre,
Alberta
if you could
sovereignty
bring
movement.
up, sorry, Andre, if you could bring up Charles's principles from his website, just that
Yes.
bullet list.
Yes. Wait a second.
So we
Here's
got about
screen.
10 minutes left, and I think it might be useful for thinking forward for the audience.
Yes.
If you were to just take a few minutes and wander through each of these, Charles.
Well, I
So the
won't
right
go
of
through.
person.
Yeah, I wonder if you can go to the very top. There's a piece that precedes that. Every person has the right to their life, liberty, and to the property they justly acquire. We each have our own mind and body, and that guarantees them the right to live without intimidation or coercion or attack, regardless of the position of whoever may be attacking us. And I'll pull up my own one here, so you can maybe scroll down a little faster. We can have our own personal beliefs, and we can express them in ways that don't harm the rights of others. Free speech, as long as you're not harming the rights of others, you can say whatever you like. We can pursue our own goals, as long as we don't violate the rights of other persons. We can join together with others to pursue our goals freely, to provide for ourselves and our family. We have the right to the property that we justly create or acquire. It belongs to us. And we can defend ourselves, our family, and our property. And we have the right to be protected from attacks from other persons, we and our property, by virtue of laws, regulations, policies, and practice. And also, we have the right to be protected from policies, regulations, or practices that violate our rights. And this, I think, is important. And some may disagree with this, but the family is a core institution of our society. It has been a core institution, and it provides for the needs of persons, and it shall be protected from undue interference by government. The duties of governments must protect and serve, not impose. They were established to protect the rights of every person, and they must do so in a transparent and accountable manner. And there's so many things that has an implication for. It must manage our public resources. It must protect every person from unjust aggressions and attacks. It must never have statutes, policies, or programs that attack the freedom or rights of any citizen. It must ensure that no citizen is deprived of any rights to provide for their families by a just means. You can't say you can't do this. The management of public property is a key thing here, and goes back to, for example, what I was mentioning with respect to the Ring of Fire in Ontario. That's a public resource. You don't have the right as government to give it away to your friends. You don't have a right, as Doug Ford had a role in, of saying, well, wait a minute, you can't develop this land in a just way that doesn't cause harm, and then say, oh, no, but my friends can do it, and let's make that land worth billions of dollars more than it was before because we've prevented you from doing reasonable things. Governments are there to protect and serve, not to impose. They must have open and public debates and discussions with respect to all major government policies and all policy changes. Yes, there will be times when government may want to restrict our rights in order to protect our bigger freedoms, but that has to be discussed. And we must ensure that citizens have an effective means of holding our governments to account. We're down at the bottom there now, Andre. So, but I don't want to leave. I'm going to. Government offices must never be abused, but the other key thing here is that citizens have responsibilities. We must recognize the rights of others. We must be constantly aware of the ability and the intent of many who hold public offices to abuse the powers of those offices to undermine our rights. And it's up to us. So we must act in a way, as the Magna Carta says, when our rights are being violated, we must get together and ensure that governments do not take steps to ensure that governments do not abuse those immense powers that are granted to them for the purpose of protecting rights in a way that undermines the rights. So how do we restore them? Essentially, it has to come from the people. The threat is there constantly of those who hold positions of power to abuse that power, to impose the powers of government, to impose their will. And that can only be stopped if people are aware, if they are intent, if they are involved, they discuss. And I am convinced it has to start with these principles, not with particular policies. Yes, people should fight for the policy fights. Yes, we should defend our own rights. We should support the rights of others. But to find the common ground, it has to be, in my view, at the level of principle.
Good, that's interesting, and it's on the website Our Principle. Gentlemen, we arrive at the mark of 2 hours of a very passionate conversation and very interesting topics that we discovered. Tim, maybe the final word or the final question for Charles.
We're not done with you, young Mr. Fincher. There are the 3 broad subjects that we discussed today. I'm more inclined to go into each of them into more detail. So a little more resolution. So if you are inclined, we may drag you back down this road at some future date.
Let me say, I would be happy to do that. I think, as I have implied, I think the key message here is to get people involved. And I think it's to get people involved in discussing at a level of principle rather than specific policy or program.
Yeah.
I've criticized policies with respect to the development of the Ring of Fire, mineral development, and so on. But that comes from a principled perspective. And you can see that that those are public resources. Governments, they don't belong to government to give away. They have an absolute duty to manage them on our behalf. So I think if we can look to find a way to engage many citizens in discussions of principles, let me say very long-standing principles. These are not things that we're inventing today.
No.
These go back thousands of years of civil and civilized societies. And I think people need to know that, because I will make a quick comment on my account of 1763 and the American Revolution and the evolution from the British system of the rights of all persons. I was in a pub one night with some friends, quite a number of years ago, and the friends had brought in a lot of historians who were there. And I said, here's the real history of Canada. And so we're drinking our beer and we're chatting. And these historians said to me, no one has ever presented it like that, but there's nothing you have said that is not true. And so somehow the myths that we have, the myths that we've created, need to be blown away as we look at the deeper principles that, if we go back to the BNA Act, founded on on principles that are inherent, I can't remember the specific words, similar to Britain, founded on principles, not on words, not on structures. but on principles. And that's the heritage that I think is worth preserving. And it is a much longer heritage than 1867 and even than 1763.
I think you're right. And in my opinion, what's important is that we can work on the long term. We cannot expect quick changes. It's a long process, and through debates, through ideas that we are exchanging. For myself today, I've learned a lot of things through, and I've started to be aware of many things that I didn't know. And maybe, like you said, it's one part of the heritage that we can leave to our children and grandchildren, to dig all this information, knowledge. And just before the live, we were backstage before you arrived, Tim, and you said something that I always forgot: wisdom.
Yeah.
The information, the knowledge, and the wisdom. I think if we based our debate on those three aspects, information, knowledge, and wisdom, we will be able to have rational discussion about those principles. Try to find them, try to elaborate them. Maybe the path will be very long, but I think it is possible. At least we tried for 2 hours. So anyway,
Cerberus is
Charles,
coming up on its 1 year anniversary in mid-October, and I find that my perspectives and my views have changed and sharpened in some things, and some things I believe to be true, I realize are not exactly true. And as we move forward and I participate in this project, I realize I am becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the status quo. And so
that's
we hope
that's one
that with,
aspect.
right? Yeah, and
That's
that
one
the viewers who participate with us and ask their important questions, the guests who come along every now and then and open our eyes, because we can get into a tunnel vision ourselves, continue to keep the material relevant, honest, and gentlemen and women come on like yourselves and actually give us wisdom, like you mentioned. And I'm grateful for that. So thank you.
Thanks you, and thank you for our audience. The questions, some comment. Thank you to Payman Ascari, who is in Alberta and introduced Charles to us. It was a pleasure to have you. So thank you for watching Cerberus at the Improv. Most probably next week we will see our host Payman Ascari will be back for another episode of Cerberus at the Improv. So Charles, thank you, and I hope you will be back eventually.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
Have a good night.